The blood tasted like copper and desperation, as Tessa Thornton gripped the rusted pliers tighter, her hand trembling so violently she could barely keep hold of the metal handles. She sat on the splintered steps of her late father's homestead, 5 miles outside Rawlins, Wyoming, with her mouth stretched wide and tears streaming down her sunburned cheeks. The infected molar had tormented her for 3 weeks now, and she could not afford the dentist in town, not after the bank had threatened foreclosure and the cattle had succumbed to disease. It was August 1883, and the high desert sun beat down mercilessly as she positioned the pliers around the tooth, whispering a prayer through her stretched lips. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze, the pliers still wedged awkwardly in her mouth. Through tear-blurred vision, she saw a rider approaching, dust rising behind his horse in golden clouds. Tessa wanted to hide, to run inside and pretend she had not been caught in such a humiliating moment, but the pain anchored her to the step. She could not move without sending fresh agony through her jaw. The cowboy pulled his horse to a stop just yards away, and she watched him dismount with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He was tall and lean, wearing a dusty brown Stetson that shadowed his face. As he approached, removing his hat, she saw dark eyes full of concern and a face weathered by sun and wind but still young, perhaps 25 or 26 years old. His black hair was longer than was fashionable, curling slightly at his collar. "Wait," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "Let me help." Tessa tried to protest, but the pliers prevented any intelligible speech. Embarrassed sounds emerged instead. She was 22 years old, and in all her years of struggling to maintain this homestead alone after her father's death 2 years prior, she had never felt more vulnerable than at this moment. The cowboy knelt before her on the dusty ground, setting his hat beside him. "My name is Dalton Zimmerman. I am a ranch hand from the Double Creek outfit north of here. I was passing through when I saw you." His eyes were kind, without a trace of mockery. "I have done this before, pulled teeth for men on the trail when we were weeks from any town. If you will let me, I can help make this easier." Tessa hesitated, but another wave of pain made her decision. She nodded slightly, unable to speak. Dalton moved closer, and she caught the scent of leather, horse, and sage. "You are going to need to trust me," he said softly. "This tooth, it is badly infected. I can see the swelling from here. You should have seen a dentist weeks ago." She managed an indignant sound, and despite the situation, she saw his mouth twitch with what might have been a suppressed smile. "But I understand why you did not," he continued, his tone more serious. "These are hard times for homesteaders. May I?" He gestured toward the pliers. Tessa released them into his hands, and he examined the tool with a frown. "These are for working wire, not teeth. Do you have anything cleaner?" "Anything we could sterilize." She pointed toward the house, and he helped her to her feet. Inside the small, tidy cabin, she directed him to a drawer where her father's better tools were kept. Dalton selected a pair of smaller pliers with a better grip, then insisted on boiling water and running the metal through the steam. While he prepared, Tessa watched him move confidently through her kitchen, building up the fire in the stove, finding a clean cloth. "You live here alone?" he asked, not looking at her directly. She nodded, then realized he could not see her while his back was turned. "Yes," she managed to say, though the word was thick and pained. "That is hard work for anyone, let alone for a woman on her own." He turned to face her, and there was no condescension in his expression, only respect. "You must be very strong." No one had said such a thing to her before. Most people in Rawlins either pitied her or thought her foolish for trying to maintain the homestead instead of selling it, and moving to town to find work as a seamstress or laundress. Her pride had kept her here, that and the memory of her father's dreams for this land. When the pliers were ready, Dalton had her sit in the best chair, positioning it near the window for light. "I am going to be honest with you," he said, crouching before her again. "This will hurt, but it will hurt much less than what you were doing to yourself, and it will be over quickly. I need you to keep very still and trust that I know what I am doing." Tessa looked into his dark eyes and found herself believing him. She nodded and opened her mouth. Dalton worked with steady confidence, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he examined the infected molar. "This needs to come out today," he murmured. "The infection is severe. You might have died if it had spread much further." The thought chilled her, but she had no time to dwell on it. Dalton positioned the pliers carefully and said, "On 3. 1, 2, he pulled on 2, and the tooth came free with a crack that Tessa felt more than heard. The pain was sharp and immediate, but mercifully brief. Dalton had a cloth ready to press against the bleeding socket, and he guided her hand to hold it in place. "Keep pressure there," he instructed. "Do you have any whiskey? You will need to rinse your mouth with it to prevent further infection." Tessa pointed to a cabinet, and Dalton retrieved the bottle her father had kept for medicinal purposes. He poured a measure into a cup and handed it to her. "Rinse and spit. Do not swallow unless you want to, though it might help with the pain." She followed his instructions, the whiskey burning the wound but also somehow making it feel cleaner. When she finally lowered the cloth, the bleeding had slowed considerably. The relief was overwhelming. The constant, throbbing agony that had been her companion for weeks was gone, replaced by a duller ache that felt manageable in comparison. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I do not know what I would have done." Dalton smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "You would have figured something out. You seem like the type who always does." He glanced around the cabin, taking in the neat interior, the mended curtains, the well-maintained furniture. "But you do not have to do everything alone." There was something in the way he said it that made Tessa's heart skip, though she told herself she was being foolish. This man was a stranger who had happened upon her at her most desperate moment. He would ride away soon and forget all about the woman who had been pulling her own tooth with wire pliers. But Dalton did not ride away. Instead, he asked, "When did you last eat something? You should have food, something soft that will not irritate the wound." Tessa realized she had not eaten since the previous evening, the pain having stolen her appetite. "I have some oatmeal," she said. "Some eggs." "Let me cook for you," Dalton offered. "You have had a shock. You should rest." It was strange, having a man in her kitchen again, cooking at her stove. Tessa sat in the chair and watched him move about, clearly comfortable with the domestic tasks. He made oatmeal with canned milk and a precious spoonful of sugar, and scrambled eggs that he cooked in bacon fat. The smell made her stomach growl despite her recent ordeal. They ate together at her small table, and Dalton told her about himself. He was from Kansas originally, had come west 3 years ago after his parents' farm had failed during a drought. He had worked various ranches, learning the trade, saving what money he could. He was 26 years old, had no wife, no children. His dream was to have his own ranch someday, though he admitted it seemed impossibly far away. "Land is expensive," Tessa said, her voice still slightly thick but becoming clearer, "and cattle more so." "That is the truth," Dalton agreed. "But I keep working, keep saving. Someday, perhaps." "You are optimistic," Tessa observed. "Is that a bad quality?" he asked, and there was a teasing light in his eyes. "No," she said softly. "I think it might be the best quality a person can have in these times." They talked for over an hour, and Tessa found herself revealing things she had told no one else. How lonely the homestead had become after her father's death. How she struggled with the heavy work, the constant repairs, the isolation. How she missed conversation, missed having someone to share meals with, missed the sound of another person's voice in the evening. Dalton listened with genuine interest, asking questions, offering observations but never unwanted advice. He understood, he said, what it meant to be alone in a vast landscape, to wonder if your dreams were foolish or worth pursuing. When he finally rose to leave, the sun was lowering toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tessa walked him to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes. "Will you be all right?" Dalton asked, one hand on his saddle horn. "That tooth socket will need care. You should rinse with salt water several times a day." "I will," Tessa promised. "Thank you again." "I owe you my life, perhaps." "You owe me nothing," Dalton said firmly. "But I would like to check on you if I may, to ensure the wound heals properly. I could ride out tomorrow afternoon after my work is finished." Tessa's heart lifted in a way that surprised her. "I would like that," she admitted. Dalton mounted his horse with easy grace, then looked down at her. "Until tomorrow, then, Miss Thornton." "Tessa," she corrected. "Please call me Tessa." "Tessa," he repeated, and the way he said her name made something warm bloom in her chest. "I am Dalton." She watched him ride away until he disappeared into the gathering dusk, one hand pressed to her aching jaw, the other clutched against her chest. Something had shifted in her world today, something beyond the removal of an infected tooth. For the first time in 2 years, she felt less alone. That night, Tessa followed Dalton's instructions carefully, rinsing her mouth with salt water, changing the cloth packing. The wound ached, but it was clean pain healing pain. She lay in her narrow bed and thought about dark eyes and gentle hands, about a voice that spoke to her with respect and kindness. She told herself not to hope for too much. Dalton was a cowboy, a drifter who worked for wages and dreamed of something better. He had no reason to involve himself with a struggling homesteader, a woman with more debts than assets. Tomorrow he might not come. He might have already forgotten his promise. But when afternoon arrived the next day, so did Dalton. Tessa heard his horse before she saw him, and her heart leaped foolishly. She had spent the morning tidying the cabin, changing into her better dress, pinning up her honey-colored hair with more care than usual. Now she hurried to the mirror to check her reflection, seeing flushed cheeks and bright eyes staring back at her. Dalton dismounted and removed his hat as she stepped onto the porch. "Good afternoon, Tessa. How are you feeling?" "Much better," she said, and it was true. The swelling had reduced significantly, and the pain was manageable. "Thanks to you," he looked pleased. "May I check the wound? I want to ensure there is no continued infection." They went inside and Dalton examined the extraction site with professional care. "It looks good," he pronounced. "You are healing well. Keep up with the salt water rinses for another few days." "I will," Tessa promised. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "Would you like some coffee? I baked bread this morning." Dalton's face lit up. "I would very much like that." They sat together again, and the conversation flowed even more easily than the day before. Dalton asked about her father, and Tessa found herself telling stories she had not shared in years. How her father had brought her to Wyoming when she was 15, full of dreams about ranching and building a legacy. How her mother had died back in Ohio before they left, and it had been just the two of them against the world. How he had taught her everything he knew about cattle, about horses, about reading the land and weather. "He would be proud of you," Dalton said quietly, "for not giving up, even when it would be easier." Tessa felt tears prick her eyes. "Some days I am not sure I am doing the right thing. The bank says I am 3 months behind on payments. I have no cattle left to sell. Winter is coming, and I do not know if I can afford enough wood and supplies to last until spring." Dalton was quiet for a moment, then said, "What if you had help?" "I have no money to pay hired hands," Tessa said bitterly. "I was not asking for money." Dalton leaned forward, his expression earnest. "The Double Creek Ranch is quiet right now. Most of the work is done for the season. My boss is a fair man who would not mind if I spent my free time helping a neighbor. I could come a few times a week, help with repairs, with the heavy work. In exchange, perhaps you might feed me. Your bread is much better than what we get at the bunkhouse." Tessa stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Dalton met her gaze directly. "Because I want to. Because I think you deserve help. Because," he paused, then continued more softly, "because I would like to spend time with you, Tessa. If that would be acceptable." The honesty in his words took her breath away. No games, no false flattery, just simple truth. "It would be acceptable," she whispered. "It would be more than acceptable." The smile he gave her was worth more than gold. Over the following weeks, Dalton became a regular presence at the homestead. He came 3 or 4 times each week, always in the afternoons after his ranch work was finished. He repaired the sagging barn door, replaced rotted fence posts, chopped enough wood to fill the shed. He worked tirelessly, refusing to stop even when Tessa protested that he was doing too much. "I like the work," he insisted. "It feels good to build something, to make something better." They fell into an easy rhythm. Tessa would cook meals that they shared together, sitting at the small table or sometimes on the porch when the weather was fine. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from philosophy to practical matters, from childhood memories to future dreams. Tessa learned that Dalton loved to read but rarely had access to books. She lent him volumes from her father's small collection, and they discussed the stories and ideas with equal enthusiasm. Dalton revealed that he played the harmonica and sometimes brought it with him, filling the evening air with melodies that were both mournful and hopeful. For her part, Tessa found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She told Dalton about her fears and doubts, her moments of despair, her stubborn determination to succeed. He listened without judgment, offering support but never trying to solve all her problems for her. He seemed to understand that she needed to maintain her independence, her sense of capability, even as she accepted his help. As September gave way to October, Tessa realized she was falling in love. It crept up on her gradually, in small moments. The way Dalton laughed at her jokes, throwing his head back with genuine mirth. The care he took with her animals, speaking softly to her horse and the few chickens she kept. The way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not watching, with an expression of such tender longing that it made her chest ache. She wondered if he felt the same, but feared to ask. What if she was misreading his kindness? What if he saw her only as a friend, someone to help and nothing more? The question was answered on a cool October evening. They had been working together to harvest the small vegetable garden before the first hard frost. It was satisfying work, pulling carrots and potatoes from the earth, cutting the last of the squash from the vines. Tessa's hands were dirty, her hair escaping from its pins, and she had never felt happier. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Dalton straightened from his work and looked at her. "Tessa," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." She set down her basket, her heart suddenly pounding. "What is it?" Dalton crossed to where she stood and took her hands in his, dirt and all. "These past weeks, they have been the best of my life. Coming here, being with you, it has changed everything for me. I think about you constantly. When I am at the ranch, I am counting the hours until I can see you again. When I am here, I never want to leave." He paused, searching her face. I have fallen in love with you, Tessa, completely and utterly. I understand if you do not feel the same way, if I am just a cowboy who has been useful to have around, but I had to tell you. I could not keep it inside any longer. Tessa felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. You foolish man, she said, her voice breaking. How could you think I do not feel the same? I love you too, Dalton. I have loved you for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything, afraid to hope. She got no further because Dalton pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It was everything a first kiss should be, tender and passionate, full of promise and longing. Tessa melted into him, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, and for a perfect moment the world consisted of nothing but the two of them and the love they shared. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know I have nothing to offer you but myself and whatever wages I can earn, but I swear I will work every day to make you happy, to help you keep this land, to build a life together. Marry me, Tessa." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They held each other as darkness fell, making plans and promises. They would marry as soon as arrangements could be made. Dalton would move to the homestead, and together they would work to make it profitable again. It would be hard, they both knew that, but they would face the challenges together. "I will talk to my boss tomorrow," Dalton said. "Perhaps he will allow me to do some work from here, checking the far ranges. Or perhaps I can find other work that allows me to stay close. Whatever it takes, we will make this succeed." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Rawlins. It was a simple ceremony with few guests, mostly people Tessa knew from town, and a few cowboys from the Double Creek Ranch who were Dalton's friends. Tessa wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Dalton had picked that morning. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the trials life might bring, there was not a dry eye in the church. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Dalton kissed his bride with such tender joy that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. Tessa Zimmerman, née Thornton, felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. They returned to the homestead, which was now truly their home, and began their married life together. Dalton proved to be an excellent partner in every way. He worked tirelessly, taking on jobs in addition to his ranch work to bring in extra income. He hired himself out to other homesteaders for specific tasks, building a reputation as a reliable worker and skilled horseman. True to his word, Dalton's boss at the Double Creek Ranch had been understanding. He allowed Dalton to work from the homestead several days a week, checking the far ranges and reporting back. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it brought in steady wages while allowing Dalton to help Tessa maintain their land. Together, they attacked the homestead's problems systematically. They sold some of Tessa's land, the least productive acres, to pay off the bank debt and give them breathing room. With the remaining land, they focused on quality over quantity, raising a small herd of cattle with careful attention. Dalton's experience proved invaluable, and Tessa's knowledge of the specific land and its challenges complemented his skills perfectly. The first winter was hard. Wyoming winters always were, and 1883 to 1884 proved particularly brutal. Blizzards swept down from the mountains, burying the homestead in snow and isolating them for days at a time. But inside their small cabin, Dalton and Tessa created warmth and comfort. They read together by lamplight. Dalton played his harmonica while Tessa sang, and they made plans for the spring. On the coldest nights, they lay together under heavy quilts, bodies intertwined, sharing heat and love. Tessa had never imagined she could be so happy, so complete. Dalton was everything she had dreamed of in a partner, patient and kind, strong and gentle, passionate and thoughtful. He treated her as an equal, respecting her opinions and knowledge while also protecting and cherishing her. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, and with it came new hope. They planted a larger garden, working side by side in the earth. They bred their best cattle, planning carefully for the future. And in May, Tessa discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton on a warm evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. He had been playing his harmonica, filling the air with a sweet melody when she reached over and stilled his hands. "Dalton," she said softly, "we are going to have a baby." For a moment he simply stared at her, his dark eyes wide with shock. Then joy flooded his face, and he let out a whoop of excitement that probably carried for miles. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughingly begged him to stop. "A baby," he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby. Tessa, you have made me the happiest man alive." They held each other as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, talking excitedly about the future. Names were discussed and discarded, plans were made, dreams were shared. Dalton vowed to build a cradle with his own hands, and Tessa began planning the baby clothes she would sew. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Tessa felt healthy and strong, and Dalton was attentive to her every need without being overbearing. He took on more of the heavy work, insisting that she rest more, but he was wise enough not to treat her as if she were fragile. Tessa appreciated his care while also maintaining her independence and contribution to their homestead. In early December, as the first snows began to fall, Tessa went into labor. The local midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Henderson, arrived and took charge. Dalton was banished to the main room where he paced nervously, listening to the sounds from the bedroom with mounting anxiety. The labor was long and difficult. As hours stretched into the night, Dalton's worry grew. He could hear Tessa's cries of pain, and it took all his willpower not to burst into the room. Mrs. Henderson emerged periodically to request more hot water or clean cloths, always assuring him that everything was progressing normally. But Dalton could see the concern in her eyes. Finally, just before dawn, a new sound filled the cabin. The strong, angry cry of a newborn. Dalton's knees nearly buckled with relief. Moments later, Mrs. Henderson appeared with a tired smile. "You have a son," she announced. "A big, healthy boy. Your wife is exhausted, but well, you may come in." Dalton entered the bedroom to find Tessa propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was the tiniest person he had ever seen. His son. Their son. "Come meet Daniel," Tessa said softly, using the name they had chosen together. Daniel Thomas Zimmerman. Dalton approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face. His tiny fists waved in the air, and his eyes, dark like his father's, squinted against the lamplight. "He is perfect," Dalton whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Tessa, he is absolutely perfect. And you are amazing. I am in awe of you." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Tessa transferred their son into his arms. Dalton held Daniel with the same gentle competence he brought to everything, supporting the baby's head, cradling him close. The infant quieted at his father's touch, seeming to sense safety and love. "Hello, Daniel," Dalton murmured. "I am your father, and I promise you, I will spend every day of my life making sure you are loved and protected and happy. You and your mother, you are my entire world." Tessa watched her husband with their newborn son, and her heart overflowed with love. This, she thought, was what she had been surviving for during all those lonely, difficult months before Dalton rode into her life. This moment, this family, this overwhelming joy. The early months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Daniel was a good baby overall, but like all infants, he demanded constant attention. Tessa and Dalton took turns walking him when he fussed at night, singing lullabies and telling stories. They marveled at every tiny milestone, every smile, every new sound. Dalton proved to be a devoted father. He would come in from work, no matter how tired, and immediately seek out his son. He carved small toys with his own hands, building a collection of wooden animals that Daniel would someday play with. He talked to the baby constantly, telling him about the world, about the land, about all the things they would do together when Daniel was older. "He cannot understand you yet," Tessa said one evening, amused, as she watched Dalton have a one-sided conversation with their 3-month-old son about the best way to break a horse. "He will understand someday," Dalton replied seriously. "And in the meantime, he likes hearing my voice." "Do you not, Daniel?" The baby gurgled happily, and Dalton looked vindicated. As Daniel grew, so did the homestead's prosperity. The years 1885 and 1886 brought good weather and good fortune. Their cattle herd increased, and they were able to sell beef at a profit. Dalton's reputation as a horseman grew, and he began breaking horses for other ranchers, bringing in additional income. Tessa sold eggs and vegetables in town, building relationships with the merchants and townspeople. They were not wealthy, not by any measure, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were happy. Their home was filled with love and laughter, with music and conversation, with the simple pleasures of a life well lived. When Daniel was 2 years old, Tessa became pregnant again. This time, she and Dalton faced the prospect with more confidence, knowing what to expect. The pregnancy was easier than the first, and when their second child arrived in the spring of 1887, the labor was mercifully shorter. This time, it was a girl, and they named her Sarah Grace Zimmerman. She had her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's dark eyes, and from the first moment, she had her entire family wrapped around her tiny finger. Daniel, now a boisterous toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from feeding to diaper changes. "Gentle," Dalton would remind his son as Daniel reached out to touch Sarah's soft hair. "She is very small. We must be gentle with her." Daniel would nod seriously and pat his sister with exaggerated care, his face scrunched with concentration. The sight never failed to make Tessa smile. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The homestead continued to thrive, and Dalton and Tessa worked as an effective team, their skills complementing each other perfectly. They expanded the house, adding 2 bedrooms so the children would have their own spaces as they grew. Dalton built the additions himself with help from friends, and Tessa made curtains and decorated the rooms with care. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Daniel grew into a strong, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning about ranching and horses and the land. Sarah was more reserved but equally intelligent, with a quick mind and a gentle heart. Both children were taught to read and write by their mother, who valued education highly. Tessa and Dalton's love for each other only deepened with time. They had faced hardships together, difficult winters and dry summers, sick animals and tight finances, but through it all, they remained united. They never forgot how they had met, how Dalton had ridden up when Tessa was at her most desperate and offered help without judgment. "You saved my life that day," Tessa said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. It was summer 1892, 9 years since that fateful August day, and they had just celebrated their 9th wedding anniversary. "You would have survived without me," Dalton replied, taking her hand. "You are the strongest person I know." "Perhaps," Tessa allowed. "But I would not have lived, not really. You gave me more than help with a tooth, Dalton. You gave me hope. You gave me love. You gave me a reason to keep fighting, to keep dreaming." Dalton lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You did the same for me. Before I met you, I was just drifting, working and saving, but without any real purpose. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to build instead of just survive. We saved each other, Tessa." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the sun set over their land. Daniel, now 8 years old, was teaching 5-year-old Sarah how to skip stones in the small creek that ran through their property. Their laughter floated on the evening air, pure and joyful. "I think we should have one more," Tessa said suddenly. Dalton turned to look at her in surprise. "Another child? Why not?" Tessa asked, her eyes sparkling. "We have love enough for a dozen children, though I am not suggesting that many. But one more would be wonderful, do not you think?" Dalton pulled her close and kissed her softly. "I think anything you want is wonderful. If you want another child, then we will have another child." They did indeed welcome one more addition to their family. In the spring of 1893, Tessa gave birth to another boy, whom they named Robert James Zimmerman. The labor was the easiest of the three, and Robert was a calm, contented baby who rarely fussed. Daniel and Sarah were thrilled with their new brother, fighting over who got to hold him and help care for him. The homestead that had once seemed like an impossible burden to maintain was now a thriving family ranch. Dalton and Tessa had built something real and lasting, not just in terms of land and cattle, but in the family they had created together. They employed 2 ranch hands now, young men who reminded Dalton of himself when he first came to Wyoming, full of dreams and determination. As the 1890s progressed, the Zimmerman Ranch became known throughout the region as a well-run operation. Dalton's expertise with horses was sought after, and he began breeding quarter horses specifically suited to ranch work. Tessa managed the financial side of the business, proving to have a sharp mind for numbers and negotiations. Together, they were formidable. But they never lost sight of what truly mattered. Family dinners were sacred, with all 5 of them gathered around the table each evening, sharing the events of the day. Sundays were reserved for rest and togetherness, with picnics in the summer and storytelling by the fire in winter. Dalton still played his harmonica, and the children had all learned to sing, filling the house with music. There were difficult times, of course. In 1896, a harsh winter decimated their cattle herd, setting them back financially. Daniel broke his arm falling from a horse when he was 12, giving his parents several terrifying hours until the doctor confirmed it would heal properly. Sarah fell seriously ill with fever when she was 9, and Tessa and Dalton took turns sitting by her bedside for 3 days until the fever broke. Through all these trials, their love and commitment to each other never wavered. If anything, the challenges made them stronger, more appreciative of the good times, more aware of how blessed they were to have each other. As the new century approached, Tessa and Dalton found themselves reflecting on how far they had come. It was a cool evening in October 1899, and they were alone in the house for a rare moment. Daniel, now 15, had taken his siblings into town for a community social. Tessa and Dalton sat by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Do you ever think about that day?" Tessa asked softly. "When I was trying to pull my own tooth," Dalton chuckled. "Often. It was the luckiest day of my life, though it certainly was not lucky for you." "I disagree," Tessa said. "It was lucky for me too. If I had not been in such desperate circumstances, if you had not ridden by at exactly that moment, We might never have met. All of this, everything we have built together, it might never have happened. Fate, Dalton murmured. I do not know if I believe in it generally, but I believe we were meant to find each other. You were waiting for me, and I was searching for you, even though neither of us knew it at the time. Tessa turned in his arms to look at him directly. At 42, Dalton was still handsome, though his dark hair was now streaked with silver, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. To her, he was as attractive as the day they met, perhaps more so because she knew every facet of his character and loved them all. I love you, she said simply, more than I can ever express with words. You are my partner, my best friend, the father of my children, the keeper of my heart. You are everything good in my life. Dalton's eyes shone with emotion. And you are my heart, Tessa. You are my home, my purpose, my greatest joy. Every day I wake up beside you, I thank God for that infected tooth that brought me to you. They laughed together at that, then kissed with the passion and tenderness of long-married lovers who know each other completely. The fire crackled beside them, warming the room, but the true warmth came from the love they shared. The years continued to roll by with the steady rhythm of ranch life. The children grew into fine young adults. Daniel developed into a skilled horseman like his father, but with his mother's head for business. He took on more responsibility at the ranch, eventually becoming a full partner in the operation. At 21, in 1905, he married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, a practical young woman named Emily who fit perfectly into the Zimmerman family. Sarah proved to have a gift for teaching and began working at the schoolhouse in Rawlins when she was 18. She was beloved by her students and respected by the community. She married at 23 in 1905 to a gentle schoolteacher from back east who had come to Wyoming seeking adventure and found love instead. They built a house in town but visited the ranch frequently. Robert, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family. He loved to read and write, filling journals with observations about ranch life and the changing West. At his parents' encouragement, he attended college in Laramie, becoming the first in the family to receive higher education. He returned home with a degree and used it to help modernize the ranch's operations while preserving its essential character. By 1910, Dalton and Tessa were grandparents several times over. Daniel and Emily had 3 children. Sarah and her husband had 2, and Robert had married and started his own family. The ranch house that had once held just Tessa alone now regularly overflowed with children and grandchildren, especially during holidays and special occasions. Tessa and Dalton, now in their late 40s and early 50s respectively, had slowed down somewhat but remained active in ranch operations. They had hired a manager to handle the day-to-day work, but both still contributed in meaningful ways. Dalton still broke horses occasionally, though he was more selective about which ones he took on, and Tessa still managed the books and made the major financial decisions. They had achieved something remarkable. The homestead that had been on the brink of foreclosure in 1883 was now one of the most successful ranches in the region. They owned several thousand acres, ran hundreds of head of cattle, and had a thriving horse breeding operation. They employed over a dozen men and supported not just their immediate family, but extended family and community members as well. But more important than financial success was the legacy of love they had created. Their children had grown up seeing a marriage based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and partnership. They understood the value of hard work, but also the importance of family and community. They had been raised with strong values and a clear sense of right and wrong. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1913, The entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Tessa, now 52, looked out at the crowd of children, grandchildren, friends, and neighbors, and marveled at how blessed she was. Her hair was more silver than honey now, and her hands showed the wear of 3 decades of ranch work, but her eyes were still bright and her smile still radiant. Dalton, 56 and distinguished-looking with his fully silver hair, stood beside her, his hand in hers as it had been for 30 years. When it came time to say a few words to their guests, he spoke from the heart. 30 years ago, I rode up to a homestead and found a young woman in the most desperate circumstances, trying to pull her own tooth with pliers. I offered to help, and that single act of kindness changed my entire life. Tessa, you have given me everything worth having: love, family, purpose, joy. You took a drifting cowboy with nothing but dreams and helped him build a life beyond his wildest imaginings. I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for 30 years of happiness. There was not a dry eye in the gathering. Tessa, tears streaming down her face, stood on tiptoe to kiss her husband amid thunderous applause and cheering from their loved ones. The years of the 1910s brought change to the West. The wild days were truly over now, replaced by civilization and progress. Automobiles began appearing on the streets of Rawlins, though the Zimmermans still preferred horses. Electricity was coming to some of the larger ranches, and there was talk of bringing it to town. The world was modernizing rapidly, and while some lamented the loss of the old ways, Tessa and Dalton adapted as they always had, taking the best of the new while preserving what was valuable from the past. World War, I touched their lives when Robert enlisted in 1917, despite his parents' worry. He served honorably and returned home safely in 1919, changed by what he had seen but still fundamentally the thoughtful, gentle young man they had raised. His return was a cause for great celebration, and the family gave thanks for his safe homecoming. The 1920s brought new prosperity to the ranch. The cattle market was strong, and their horse breeding operation had an excellent reputation throughout the region and beyond. Daniel had taken over most of the day-to-day management, allowing Dalton and Tessa to step back and enjoy their later years, though they remained actively involved and consulted on all major decisions. They spent their time with grandchildren, of whom there were now more than a dozen. They took long rides across their land, just the two of them, reminiscing about the early days and marveling at how far they had come. They read together in the evenings. Dalton still played his harmonica, and they remained as devoted to each other as ever. On a warm summer evening in 1925, Tessa and Dalton celebrated their 42nd anniversary. They were alone on the porch, watching the sun set over land they had worked for more than 4 decades. Tessa was 64, Dalton 68, and both showed the marks of age and a life well lived. "Do you have any regrets?" Tessa asked, her head on Dalton's shoulder as it had been so many times over the years. Dalton was quiet for a moment, considering. "None," he finally said. "Not a single one. Every choice I made, every path I took led me to you and to this life." "How could I regret any of it?" "I feel the same," Tessa said softly. "Even the hard times, the painful times, they were worth it because we faced them together." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The land around them was peaceful, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. It was the same land where Tessa had once sat in desperation, trying to pull her own tooth, where a cowboy had ridden up and offered help that transformed both their lives. "Thank you," Tessa whispered. "For what?" Dalton asked. for seeing me that day, for not riding past, for offering help when I needed it most, for loving me, for building this life with me, for everything." Dalton kissed the top of her head tenderly. "Thank you for letting me help, for trusting me, for loving me back, for being my partner in everything, for giving me a home and a family and a reason to wake up every morning with gratitude. Thank you for 42 years of happiness, Tessa. You are and always will be the love of my life." They remained there until the stars filled the sky. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a love that would endure for the rest of their days and live on in the family and legacy they created together. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as they always do. Tessa and Dalton faced the loss of friends, watched the world continue to change, and dealt with the inevitable challenges of aging bodies. But through it all, their love remained constant, a beacon that guided their entire family. In 1933, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, a true golden anniversary. The celebration was enormous, with family coming from across the country to honor the couple who had built such an extraordinary life together. There were great-grandchildren now, young voices filling the ranch house with laughter and energy. Dalton, now 76, was slowed by arthritis but still active in mind and spirit. Tessa, 72, had developed some health issues but remained sharp and engaged. They still lived in the homestead, though it had been expanded and modernized considerably over the decades. They still slept in the same bedroom, still reached for each other in the night, still found comfort and joy in each other's presence. The following years were gentler ones. They spent time with family, particularly enjoying their great-grandchildren. They took short walks around the ranch, pointing out places that held special memories. They told stories of the early days, ensuring that the younger generations understood the struggles and triumphs that had built the Zimmerman legacy. In the spring of 1938, Dalton's health began to decline more seriously. He developed heart trouble, and the doctor was frank about the prognosis. Dalton accepted it with the same calm courage he had shown throughout his life, more concerned about Tessa than himself. "Promise me you will not grieve too long," he said one evening as they sat together, his hand holding hers with a grip still surprisingly strong. "You have so much life left to live, so many people who love you and need you. Do not waste time mourning an old cowboy." "You are not just an old cowboy," Tessa said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "You are my husband, my love, my everything. How can I not grieve?" "Grieve if you must," Dalton conceded. "But then live, Tessa. Live for both of us. Enjoy the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Find joy in each day. That is what I want for you." Tessa nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They held each other as night fell, two people who had shared 55 years together, knowing their time was drawing to a close. Dalton Zimmerman passed away peacefully in his sleep on a warm June night in 1938, with Tessa beside him as she had been for more than half a century. He was 81 years old. His passing was mourned by the entire community, for he had touched many lives with his kindness, integrity, and generosity. Tessa grieved deeply, as anyone would after losing such a profound love. But she also celebrated the incredible life they had shared, the family they had built, the legacy they had created. She lived another 12 years, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, telling stories of Dalton and their life together, ensuring that his memory lived on vividly. She often sat on the porch in the evenings, looking out over the land they had worked together, and felt his presence beside her. She would remember that August day in 1883 when she had been at her lowest point, pulling her own tooth in desperation, and a cowboy had ridden up and said, "Wait, let me help." Those 4 words had changed everything, had set in motion a love story that spanned decades and created a family legacy that would endure for generations. When Tessa Zimmerman passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1950, at the age of 89, she was laid to rest beside Dalton in the small cemetery outside Rawlins. Their graves stood side by side under an ancient cottonwood tree, marked by simple but elegant headstones that bore their names, dates, and a single inscription chosen by their children. Together they built a legacy of love. The Zimmerman Ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, who never forgot the story of how it all began. The tale of Tessa pulling her own tooth and Dalton stopping to help became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of how a single moment of kindness and connection can change everything. In the main house, which had been preserved and maintained by the family, a faded photograph hung in a place of honor. It showed a young couple on their wedding day, Tessa in her mother's altered dress and Dalton in his best suit, looking at each other with expressions of such love and hope that everyone who saw it could not help but smile. Beside it hung Dalton's old harmonica, now a cherished heirloom, and a pair of ancient pliers, rusted with age, that represented the moment when 2 lonely souls found each other and built a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. The story of Tessa and Dalton Zimmerman became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of partnership, and the enduring nature of true love. It reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the greatest adventures begin in the most unlikely ways, that help offered without expectation can change lives, and that love found in the harsh landscape of the Wild West can bloom into something beautiful and lasting. Their great-great-grandchildren, living in a world unimaginably different from the Wyoming of 1883, still gathered at the ranch for reunions and celebrations. They still told the story of how great-great-grandma Tessa had been pulling her own tooth when great-great-grandpa Dalton rode up and offered to help. They still marveled at how that single moment of connection had led to everything they now had: the ranch, the family, the legacy of love and hard work and integrity. The homestead where it all began still stood, carefully maintained as a reminder of simpler times and enduring values. Visitors to the ranch often asked to see it, to stand where Tessa had sat in her desperate moment, to imagine the young cowboy riding up with kindness in his eyes and help in his hands. And in the evenings, when the sun set over the Wyoming landscape, much as it had for centuries, when the cattle lowed in the distance and the wind whispered through the grass, it was easy to imagine 2 figures sitting on that old porch. A man with dark eyes and gentle hands, a woman with honey hair and fierce determination, holding hands and watching the stars emerge, their love as vast and enduring as the western sky above them. Their story was one of chance and choice, of hardship transformed into hope, of 2 lonely people finding in each other everything they needed to build not just a life, but a legacy. It was a story of the Wild West at its best, not of violence and lawlessness, but of courage and compassion, of building and creating, of love that conquered all obstacles. And it all began with a simple offer of help, 4 words spoken in kindness. "Wait, let me help." Those words echoed through the generations, a reminder that we never know when a simple act of compassion might change not just one life, but countless lives yet to come. The Zimmerman family carried that lesson forward, making it a cornerstone of how they lived and interacted with the world. They helped neighbors in need, offered kindness to strangers, and believed in the power of community and connection. The ranch itself became a symbol of what could be achieved through partnership and perseverance. What had once been a failing homestead on the verge of foreclosure had become, through the combined efforts of Tessa and Dalton, one of the most successful and respected operations in Wyoming. But more than that, it had become a home in the truest sense, a place where love had taken root and flourished, where children had been raised with strong values, where generations had learned the meaning of family. Daniel, their eldest, often reflected on his parents' relationship as he grew older. He had watched them work side by side for his entire childhood and young adulthood, had seen how they supported each other through every challenge, had witnessed the small daily gestures of love and respect that sustained their marriage. When he raised his own children, he consciously modeled his marriage after theirs, creating another generation of partnership and mutual devotion. Sarah, their daughter, carried her mother's strength and her father's gentleness into her own life. As a teacher, and later as a community leader in Rawlins, she touched countless lives with the same compassion Dalton had shown when he stopped to help a desperate woman pull her tooth. She established a fund to help struggling families, remembering how close her mother had come to losing everything before Dalton arrived. Robert, the youngest, immortalized his parents' story in a series of writings that were eventually published and became regional classics. His accounts of early Wyoming ranch life, centered around the love story of Tessa and Dalton, helped preserve the history and values of that era for future generations. He made sure their story was not forgotten, that the lessons it contained continued to inspire. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren, growing up with the story of how their family began, understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. They learned that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made daily through actions large and small. They learned that true partnership meant supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating successes together, and always being willing to help when help was needed. In the modern world, where the Wild West seemed impossibly distant, the story of Tessa and Dalton remained relevant. It spoke to universal truths about human connection, about the courage required to accept help, about the generosity of spirit that offers help without expecting anything in return. It reminded people that the greatest treasures in life are not material but relational, that wealth measured in love and family far exceeds any financial fortune. The old homestead became a destination for family pilgrimages. Young couples newly in love would visit, standing where Tessa and Dalton had stood, hoping to capture some of the magic that had blessed that relationship. Parents brought children to teach them about their heritage, about the values that had built their family. Elderly family members came to remember, to feel close to ancestors who had lived with such purpose and passion. Inside the homestead, which was maintained as it had been in Tessa and Dalton's time, visitors could see the simple life they had led. The kitchen where Dalton had cooked oatmeal for Tessa after removing her tooth, the table where they had shared countless meals and conversations, the bedroom where their children had been born, the porch where they had sat on summer evenings, making plans and dreaming dreams. Each object in the house told part of their story. The books they had read together, pages worn from repeated handling. The cradle Dalton had built with his own hands for Daniel, later used for Sarah and Robert and eventually for grandchildren. The quilts Tessa had sewn during long Wyoming winters. The tools Dalton had used to build and repair, to create and maintain. All of it preserved as a testament to lives well lived. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Tessa and Dalton's legacy was intangible. It lived in the way their descendants treated each other and treated others. It lived in the commitment to family that characterized every generation. It lived in the work ethic, the integrity, the compassion that were passed down like precious heirlooms from parent to child. The family gatherings that continued to take place at the ranch were celebrations not just of kinship, but of the values Tessa and Dalton had embodied. People traveled from across the country to attend, bringing with them the various paths their lives had taken, but always returning to this place that represented their roots. Doctors and teachers, ranchers and business people, artists and scientists, all connected by the common thread of this love story that had started their family line. At these gatherings, the story was always told again, never losing its power despite countless retellings. The youngest children would hear for the first time about great-great-great-grandmother Tessa, and the tooth and the cowboy who stopped to help. Teenagers would listen with new understanding as they began to experience their own first loves. Young adults preparing to marry would hear it as a blueprint for building a lasting relationship. Middle-aged couples would find inspiration to recommit to their own marriages. And the elderly would hear it as validation of their own life choices, confirmation that love and family had always been what mattered most. The story had variations depending on who told it, but certain elements remained constant. Tessa's courage in trying to pull her own tooth, Dalton's kindness in offering help, the immediate connection they felt, the slow building of trust and love, the proposal in the garden, the wedding in the small church, the challenges they faced together, the children they raised, the ranch they built, the legacy they created. And always, always, the enduring nature of their love, continuing until Dalton's last breath and beyond into Tessa's remaining years. What made the story so powerful was its authenticity. This was not a fairy tale or a romanticized legend. It was a true account of real people who had faced real struggles and found real joy. The hardships were not glossed over, the poverty, the pain, the difficulties of life in the Wild West, the losses and sorrows that touched every life. But neither were the triumphs minimized, the successes earned through hard work, the pleasures of family life, the satisfaction of building something lasting, the deep and abiding love that sustained them through everything. As the 21st century progressed, and the world changed in ways Tessa and Dalton could never have imagined, their story remained a touchstone for their descendants. In times of difficulty, family members would ask themselves what Tessa and Dalton would have done, how they would have faced this challenge. In times of joy, they would feel the presence of those ancestors who had made everything possible, whose love had set in motion the chain of events that led to this moment. The ranch continued to operate successfully, adapted to modern times but still fundamentally true to the principles Tessa and Dalton had established. Sustainable practices, humane treatment of animals, fair treatment of workers, quality over quantity, integrity in all dealings. These were not just business practices but values, and they ensured that the Zimmerman name remained respected throughout Wyoming and beyond. Educational programs were established at the ranch, teaching young people about ranching, about history, about environmental stewardship. School groups visited to learn about life in the Wild West, but they also learned about the human values that transcended any particular era. Tessa and Dalton's story was used to illustrate how ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things through love, partnership, and determination. Scholars of Western history became interested in the Zimmerman story as well, seeing in it a counter-narrative to the more violent and individualistic tales often associated with the Wild West. Here was a story of cooperation rather than conflict, of building rather than destroying, of love rather than violence. It represented an aspect of Western history that was equally true but often overlooked in favor of more dramatic tales of gunfights and outlaws. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, academic papers were published, all examining various aspects of the Zimmerman legacy. But for the family itself, the story remained deeply personal. It was not history or scholarship but identity, the foundation of who they were and what they believed. And through it all, through the generations and the centuries, the central truth remained unchanged. On an August day in 1883, a desperate young woman had been trying to pull her own tooth with pliers. A cowboy had ridden up and said, "Wait, let me help." And from that moment of connection, of compassion, of two lonely souls recognizing something in each other, had grown a love that transformed not just two lives but countless lives across generations. It was a story about the power of kindness, about the importance of being willing to both offer and accept help. It was about seeing the humanity in others and responding with compassion rather than judgment. It was about building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. It was about facing life's challenges as partners, sharing burdens and joys equally. It was about creating something lasting, something that would outlive its creators and benefit generations yet to come. Most of all, it was a love story in the truest and best sense. Not the superficial romance of instant attraction, though that had certainly played a part, but the deep, abiding love that comes from truly knowing another person and choosing them every day. The love that survives hardship and celebrates triumph. The love that grows stronger rather than weaker with time. The love that creates a legacy extending far beyond the two people who share it. Tessa and Dalton Zimmerman had lived ordinary lives in many ways, facing the common struggles of their time and place. But in their commitment to each other, in the family they built together, in the values they embodied and passed on, they had created something extraordinary. Their story became a beacon of hope and inspiration, proving that true love not only exists, but can flourish even in the harshest circumstances, that two people working together can accomplish more than either could alone, and that a life built on love and partnership is the richest life possible. And it all began with 4 simple words, spoken in kindness on a hot August day in Wyoming. "Wait, let me help."